In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the terrain is so rough that even experienced soldiers struggle to breathe in the thin air, a team of American Navy SEALs walked into what seemed like a perfect intelligence opportunity. They were hunting a high-value target, someone who had been responsible for dozens of deaths. But intelligence in war is like trying to see through fog. Sometimes what you think you see is not really there. On that particular day in 2005, a group of elite warriors would face a choice that would test every ounce of their training, courage, and will to survive. One sniper, positioned on a ridge that nobody expected, would change the course of the mission in a single moment. This is the story of what happens when split-second decisions mean the difference between going home and becoming a name on a memorial wall. This is the story of survival, sacrifice, and the weight of choices made under impossible circumstances. The helicopter cut through the cold morning air like a knife through water, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb sat with his team as they approached the landing zone. His eyes were sharp, focused, trained by 20 years of military service to notice things that ordinary people would miss. The Hindu Kush Mountains stretched below them in waves of brown and gray, beautiful and deadly at the same time. Webb had been in this part of Afghanistan before, but every mission felt like the first time, because every mission could be your last. He had 2 daughters back home in Virginia, and he made sure to remember their faces before every operation. Not in a way that made him hesitate, but in a way that made him certain. He was doing this so they could have a childhood without fear. The radio crackled. The pilot's voice came through, professional and steady. 2 minutes to insertion. Webb nodded and looked at his team. There were 12 of them, all Navy SEALs, all men who had trained together for months. They knew each other's movements the way musicians in an orchestra know where the other instruments are playing without looking. Their names were classified, their faces hidden from the public eye, but their story was about to become something that would be told and retold by military strategists and soldiers for years to come. The intelligence they had received was solid, or at least, that's what the analysts back at the forward operating base had said. A high-value target named Hassan Khan was supposed to be in a compound in the Konar province, near the border with Pakistan. Khan was not just another Taliban fighter. He was an organizer, a recruiter, someone who had blood on his hands from dozens of attacks. The decision had come from the top. Get Khan, and you disrupt an entire network of attacks planned against American and Afghan forces. It made sense on a map in an air-conditioned room back at base. It made sense in strategy meetings where people debated tactics without bullets flying at them. Webb had learned long ago not to trust things that made sense only in theory. He had learned that reality always had surprises, and usually those surprises tried to kill you. As the helicopter began to descend, dust rose up from the ground like the earth itself was trying to hide them. The landing zone was in a narrow valley, surrounded by peaks that climbed higher than the clouds. It was, according to the intelligence briefing, an area where local forces had confirmed minimal enemy activity. The word minimal would come back to haunt them. Minimal was not the same as none. Minimal meant there was room for something to happen, room for danger, room for mistakes. The moment the helicopter's landing struts touched the rocky ground, Webb's team moved. Training took over. Each man knew exactly what he needed to do, and they did it without hesitation. Equipment was checked, weapons were ready, and, within seconds, they were moving away from the helicopter and toward the tree line that marked the edge of the village they were targeting. The helicopter pulled up and away, its rotors creating a sound that echoed through the valley like a warning. Webb led his team down the hillside, moving carefully but quickly. The element of surprise was crucial. The longer they took to reach the target, the more time Khan would have to disappear into the network of tunnels that honeycombed these mountains. They moved through a dried riverbed, jumping from rock to rock, their boots barely making a sound. These men had practiced this kind of movement thousands of times. Running through unfamiliar terrain at speed while maintaining tactical awareness was something they could do in their sleep, though nobody actually did it in their sleep because they would probably break their necks. The village itself was small, maybe 20 or 30 houses built from stone and mud. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. The sound of roosters could be heard. It seemed peaceful, almost ordinary. But Webb knew that ordinary was sometimes the most dangerous thing in Afghanistan. A village that looked peaceful might be hiding fighters in every building. A shepherd on a hillside might be a scout for an enemy force. A child playing in the dirt might run to warn a Taliban commander that Americans were coming. This was not a conflict where the enemy wore uniforms and stayed in military installations. This was a conflict where the enemy lived among civilians, hid among them, used them as shields. As the team approached the first buildings, Webb's second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Devin Martinez, signaled from the left flank. He had spotted movement. 2 men, armed with AK-47s, were moving from one building to another. The men had not seen the SEALs yet, but it was clear that security was present. More security than the intelligence had suggested. Webb's jaw tightened. This was when things could start going wrong. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in the small ways that accumulate until they become big problems. Webb raised his hand, and the team froze. 12 warriors, moving as one unit, breathing slowly, watching. Webb made a quick decision and signaled Martinez. They would eliminate the armed men before they could raise an alarm. It had to be done quietly, had to be done fast, had to be done in a way that did not give away their position to anyone else in the village who might be watching. Martinez was a sharpshooter, one of the best Webb had ever worked with. He had a steady hand and an even steadier mind. He raised his rifle, adjusted his sight, and controlled his breathing the way a sniper is trained to do. The first shot was barely louder than a cough, muffled by the suppressor on Martinez's rifle. One of the armed men dropped like someone had unplugged him. The second man turned, confused for just a second, and that second was all Martinez needed. The second shot. Another body on the ground. The entire exchange had taken maybe 5 seconds, and now there were 2 dead men lying in the dirt between 2 buildings in a small Afghan village. They would not be calling for reinforcements. They would not be firing at the team. They would not be going home to their families. But they had families. Webb knew this, had learned long ago to hold 2 contradictory truths in his mind at the same time. They were soldiers or fighters, at least, and they were trying to kill him and his team. At the same time, they were human beings, they had mothers, and the world would be different because they were no longer in it. Webb pushed that thought away. He had learned how to compartmentalize. You had to, or you would go insane. The team moved forward, using the buildings as cover. The compound where Khan was supposed to be was now visible, maybe 100 meters ahead. It was larger than the other buildings, surrounded by a low wall made of stones. This was it. This was where the intelligence said everything would happen. Webb could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, even though he knew what came next would determine whether he and his men would still be alive in 1 hour. As they moved closer, something changed in the air. Webb had been a soldier long enough to recognize the change. It was subtle, hard to describe to anyone who had not experienced it. It was the way the light fell differently, the way sounds seemed to pause for a moment, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. It was the feeling just before things exploded into chaos. Webb's instincts were screaming at him, but his intelligence briefing was telling him something else. Intelligence said minimal enemy activity. Instincts said something is wrong here. Before Webb could process this contradiction, the world around him erupted in gunfire. It came from multiple directions, from the roofs of buildings, from windows, from behind walls. The noise was deafening, not organized fire but the kind of fire that comes from lots of weapons shooting at the same targets. Webb and his team had less than a second to react. They dove for cover, pressing themselves against whatever was closest, a wall, a drainage ditch, a pile of rocks. The bullets were coming so fast that it was impossible to count them. Dust kicked up around them, bits of rock exploded where bullets impacted, the air itself seemed to become dangerous. Contact! Webb shouted, his voice cutting through the sound of gunfire. Multiple positions, north and east. Martinez, suppressive fire. Gomez, take your squad and move to the left building. Harris, I want comms back to the FOB now. His men responded instantly. Despite the fact that they were being ambushed by what seemed like a much larger force, despite the fact that bullets were flying inches over their heads, his team moved with the precision of dancers who had choreographed this movement 1,000 times. Except they were choreographing it with live ammunition, with real danger, with the knowledge that a mistake would mean someone would not be going home. Martinez started laying down suppressive fire, his rifle barking orders to the enemy to stay down and stay quiet. Gomez and 3 other SEALs rushed toward the left building, using the terrain to their advantage, moving from cover to cover. Webb stayed where he was, trying to identify where the enemy fire was coming from, trying to understand the tactical situation. As a commander, he needed to see the whole board, needed to understand how many enemy fighters they were facing, needed to figure out how to keep his men alive. What he could see was that this was much bigger than a small security force protecting one target. There were at least 20 fighters, maybe more. They were positioned to create a crossfire, to pin the SEALs in place where they could be picked off one by one. This was not a group of fighters caught by surprise. This was an ambush, planned and prepared. Somehow, someone had known that the SEALs were coming. The intelligence had been compromised, or the intelligence had been wrong from the start. Harris, his communications specialist, was working frantically on the radio. Javelin 6, this is Eagle 1. We have TIC, troops in contact, multiple enemy positions. We are pinned down at grid coordinates. Harris gave the exact location, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Tick. Troops in contact. It meant that the situation had changed from a planned operation to a firefight for survival. Webb heard the response crackle through the radio. The FOB was sending help. Helicopters were being scrambled. Air support was on the way. But air support would take time, and, in a firefight, time was the thing you ran out of first. Webb made a decision. They could not stay in this position. They would be overrun. They could not advance toward the compound where Khan was supposed to be because that was where the heaviest fire was coming from. That left one option. They had to retreat, had to break contact with the enemy, had to find a defensible position and hold it until help arrived. All units, fall back to the ridgeline. Webb shouted into his radio. Bound and suppress. Martinez, keep their heads down. The team began a fighting retreat, moving backward while still returning fire, still trying to suppress the enemy. It was dangerous work. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and someone would catch a bullet. Webb counted his men as they moved 6, 7, 8. Where was Gomez's team? He had sent 4 men to the left building. Had they made it? Were they still in the fight? Then, he saw them. Gomez and 2 other men came running from the left building, providing suppressive fire as they moved. But, there were only 3. Gomez's team had been 4. One of them was missing. Webb's stomach tightened. A missing man meant a wounded man or a dead man. Either way, it meant one of his people was not making it back to the ridge. But, there was no time to stop and help. If they stopped, they would all be pinned down. The best way to help their missing teammate was to establish a strong defensive position and call in the helicopters. The retreat continued, and, slowly, the team made it back to the ridgeline that Webb had identified during his approach. It was a good position, high ground with clear views of the valley below. The enemy fighters came into view occasionally, pressing their attack, trying to finish what they had started. But, the ridge gave the SEALs an advantage. They could see the enemy, and the enemy had a harder time seeing them. Martinez set up his rifle and started engaging targets at long distance, and, with each shot, one more fighter went down. Webb was trying to get a tactical picture of the situation when Harris touched his arm and pointed to the left. "Sir, movement. Heavy movement. A lot of fighters, coming up through the valley. Reinforcements, I think." Webb looked through his binoculars and felt his heart rate increase for the first time since the ambush started. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, moving through the valley toward their position. This was not just a local security force. This was a coordinated attack, well planned and well executed. The ambush had worked. The SEALs had been separated, divided, pinned down. The enemy was reinforcing, bringing more fighters to the fight. Webb knew that his team could hold the ridge for a while, but they could not hold it forever. Not against these numbers. Not without air support. He keyed his radio. Javelin 6, this is Eagle 1. Enemy reinforcements moving toward our position. We have Kia and, at least one MIA. We need air support immediately. What is the status of those birds? The voice that came back was calm but urgent. Eagle 1, we have Apaches en route, ETA 8 minutes. Predator drone is already in the area, weapons hot. We are scanning for your missing personnel. Stand by for fire support. 8 minutes. Webb calculated the distances in his head. At the rate these fighters were moving, they would have enough numbers to overrun the ridge in probably 5 or 6 minutes. 8 minutes was too long. They needed air support now. But the Apaches were 8 minutes away, and the world did not care what they needed. The answer was going to come from a different direction. High up on a mountain ridge that was almost invisible in the afternoon haze, a sniper had been watching the entire situation unfold. His name was Sergeant Rick Donovan, and he was not supposed to be where he was. He was actually supposed to be somewhere else entirely, supporting a different operation. But his commanding officer had shifted the support pattern at the last minute, and Donovan had ended up on this particular ridge with a 300 Win mag rifle, a spotter with binoculars, and absolutely no communication with Webb's team. Donovan did not know who Webb was. Webb did not know that Donovan was there. But Donovan could see the valley, could see the enemy fighters moving toward the ridge where the SEALs were dug in, and could see that without outside help, those Americans on the ridge were going to die. Donovan adjusted his rifle, looked through his scope, and began to do what he had been trained to do. He began to take shots. Sergeant Rick Donovan was not a man who was known for being talkative. His spotter, a younger specialist named James Chen, had worked with him for 8 months and could count the number of unnecessary sentences Donovan had spoken on both hands and still have fingers left over. But that was fine. In sniper work, talking was dangerous. Talking could give away your position. Talking could distract you from the work. The work was everything, and the work required focus so intense that normal human conversation seemed like a distraction from what really mattered. Donovan had been positioned on this ridge since before dawn. His orders were straightforward: provide overwatch for the general area, monitor enemy movement, and report anything significant back to the command center. He had done all of this with the precision that had made him the sniper with the highest confirmed kill count in his regiment. 43 confirmed kills over 2 tours of duty. 43 fighters who would not be going home. 43 moments where Donovan had looked through his scope, identified a target, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. 43 times where he had directly changed the course of this war. What he had not been told, and what he did not know, was that Lieutenant Webb's team was operating in the valley below. There was no radio chatter about it on his frequency. The operation was compartmentalized, which was normal for special operations. Different units did not always know what other units were doing. It kept security tight and reduced the chance of friendly fire incidents. But it also meant that sometimes one unit did not know that another unit needed help. When Chen first saw the figures moving through the valley, dozens of them, armed and moving with clear purpose, he did not immediately recognize them as enemy fighters. In Afghanistan, there were legitimate armed groups, tribal militias, local defense forces. Not every armed group was Taliban. Not every armed person was trying to kill Americans. But Chen had learned to read the patterns. He had learned to see the way military units moved, the way they coordinated, the way they moved toward a specific objective with clear intention. Contact, Chen said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper even though there was nobody around to hear him. Multiple personnel, moving north through the valley. Armed, organized movement. Estimate 30, maybe 40 fighters. Donovan was already moving his rifle to track them. His scope was powerful enough that he could see the individual faces of the fighters if he needed to. He could see that most of them were carrying AK-47s. He could see that some of them were carrying heavier weapons, including at least 2 RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. Those could cause real problems for whatever was below. "Call it in," Donovan said, and Chen immediately keyed the radio to report the movement to the command center. But, as they watched, something happened that made the situation suddenly clear. The fighters stopped. They took cover positions. They began to shoot. Not at random, but at something specific, something in the terrain below that Donovan could not quite see from this angle. Donovan shifted his position slightly and, then, he saw them. Americans. A small group of Americans, dug in on a ridge below, fighting for their lives against overwhelming numbers. Donovan did not know who they were. He did not know their names or their unit. But, he knew that they were Americans, and he knew that they were about to be overrun. "Chen, where are those reinforcements coming from?" Donovan asked, his voice steady. Chen was tracking the movement with his binoculars, doing math in his head, calculating distances and speeds. "Northwest, maybe half a click away, moving this direction fast. If they reach the Americans' position, it's over. The Americans are heavily outnumbered." Donovan made a decision. He did not ask for permission. He did not call back to command and ask what he should do. Permission would take time, and time was something the Americans below did not have. Donovan had been trained to make decisions. He had been trained to act. Right now, those Americans needed him to do both. "I'm going to engage those reinforcements," Donovan said. "See if I can thin them out, slow them down. You keep tracking our people below and anyone else that moves in this area. If you see a problem developing, you tell me immediately." Donovan's rifle was already dialed in to the exact distance of the valley. 800 meters. It was a long shot, but not an impossible one. Not for someone who had done this 43 times before. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and identified his first target. A fighter in the front of the column, someone who looked like he might be in a leadership position. Leadership positions had to be filled by someone, and if you could kill the leaders, you could disrupt the whole operation. Donovan's finger moved to the trigger with the delicacy of a brain surgeon. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder, and, down in the valley, 300 yards away from where Donovan sat, one of the approaching fighters fell. "Target down," Chen said, his voice still calm. "Good hit. They're dispersing." Donovan was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent case, loading a new round. This was rhythm, this was what sniper work was really about. Not the drama, not the perfect shot at impossible distance, but the steady, methodical work of identifying targets and eliminating them, one by one, while your heart stayed calm and your hands stayed steady. Donovan took another shot. And another. And another. The approaching column of fighters began to slow. They took cover, began to return fire in the direction of Donovan's position, but they did not know exactly where he was. They were shooting at a ridge where they had heard a noise, not at a specific position. Their fire was not effective. Meanwhile, Donovan's fire was very effective. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, deadly. "Sir, you're creating a problem," Chen said, his binoculars tracking the movement of new fighters. "More enemy troops, moving in from the east. I think they're trying to figure out where your shots are coming from. If they locate you, we're in trouble." Donovan grunted. He had already considered this possibility. Snipers were valuable targets. A sniper could kill from distance that made it hard to be killed in return, but if you stayed in one spot long enough, people could triangulate your position, figure out where you were, and bring overwhelming force against you. Donovan had perhaps 10 more minutes before it would become too dangerous to stay in this position. But 10 minutes was a long time in a firefight. 10 minutes of suppressive fire from an elevated position could change everything. 10 minutes could allow pinned-down soldiers to organize a withdrawal. 10 minutes could allow reinforcements to arrive. 10 minutes could mean the difference between an ambush that succeeded and an ambush that failed. Donovan continued working. The approaching column was now taking significant casualties. Maybe half of them had made it to solid cover. The rest were in the open, and Donovan was targeting them with cold efficiency. This was not personal. This was not about hatred or revenge. It was about the simple arithmetic of warfare. Fewer enemy fighters meant better odds for the Americans below. Below, on the ridge where Webb's team was dug in, something unexpected was happening. The heavy enemy fire that had been coming from multiple directions suddenly began to slacken. The fighters who had been pressing the attack began to take cover. Nobody knew where the fire was coming from, but everyone could see that it was very accurate and very deadly. "Someone is engaging the enemy from outside the valley," Harris reported to Webb. "I'm getting reports from the command center. There's a sniper working from elevation, somewhere northeast of our position. He's breaking up the attack." Webb looked through his binoculars and tried to locate the sniper's position. He could not see him, which was exactly the point. A sniper who was visible was a dead sniper. But he could see the effects of the sniper's work. Enemy fighters were being picked off, the reinforcements were being stopped, the momentum of the ambush was being interrupted. "Get his position, get him on the radio, I want to know who he is," Webb ordered. But even as he said it, he knew it probably would not work. Sniper teams usually operated on different communication frequencies. They would be supporting the operation but might not have direct contact with the units they were supporting. The minutes stretched on. Donovan continued to take shots. Chen continued to track the movement of enemy forces. And, down in the valley, the Americans continued to fight, now with the knowledge that they were not alone, that somebody was watching over them from above, that somebody was doing everything possible to make sure they lived through this day. But the situation was still critical. Donovan could see that more fighters were beginning to coordinate on the eastern approach. This was the problem with having a sniper position. You could see more of the battlefield than anyone else, which meant you could see all the ways that the situation could still go wrong. The problem was still superior numbers. The problem was still that the Americans were pinned down. The problem was still that without air support, eventually the weight of the enemy numbers would overwhelm everything. Donovan was about to suggest to Chen that they needed to think about moving when the sound of helicopter rotors cut through the air. A lot of helicopter rotors. Donovan looked up and felt a surge of relief. The cavalry was arriving. 2 Apache attack helicopters came in low over the mountains, their weapons systems hot, their pilots trained and ready for exactly this kind of fight. The transformation of the battle was almost instantaneous. The Apaches did not need to be subtle. They were flying tanks. Their machine guns opened up, and the sound was like nothing else on Earth. The enemy fighters, who had been holding their positions and pressing the attack, suddenly broke. They began to withdraw, trying to get away from the helicopters, trying to reach terrain where the aircraft could not follow them. Within minutes, the organized assault had turned into a rout. The fighters were running, trying to escape, abandoning their wounded and leaving their dead behind. Donovan watched through his scope as the battle transformed. The Americans were no longer being ambushed. They were now the predators, and the enemy fighters were the prey. He made the decision to stop shooting. The Apaches had things under control now, and the last thing Donovan wanted was to accidentally hit American personnel with a long-distance shot. The worst thing a sniper could do was friendly fire casualties. "Stand down," Donovan told Chen. "Let the helicopters finish this." Chen nodded. They had done their job. They had bought time. They had disrupted the enemy's attack. They had done everything a sniper team could do in a situation like this, and they had done it well. Now it was time to let the machines do their work and, then, extract themselves before the enemy could triangulate their position and bring overwhelming force against them. But, even as the immediate crisis was resolved, Donovan knew that things were still complicated. Webb had reported Kia and at least one MIA. The battle might be won, but people had died. People had been left behind. The war was far from over. Down in the valley, Webb was already moving. The helicopter support had broken the ambush, but he still had one major problem. Sergeant Dale Patterson was missing. Patterson was one of his best men, a 14-year veteran with 2 combat tours and the kind of steady character that made him reliable in any situation. He had gone into the left building with Gomez, and Gomez had come out with only 2 men. That meant Patterson was either wounded and hiding, or he was dead, or he was captured. Any of those possibilities was bad in different ways. "Gomez, I need a full sit rep on Patterson," Webb said, moving up to where Gomez was dug in. Gomez was a big man, with the kind of calm demeanor that came from growing up in situations where you had to be calm or you would fall apart. We went into the building, and there was fire coming from the back. We returned fire, moved through the structure. Patterson was beside me, then there was a burst of fire, and he was hit. I saw him go down. I turned around to get to him, but there was a fighter coming up the stairs. I had to engage him. By the time I turned back around, Patterson was gone. Either he crawled out on his own, or someone took him. Webb processed this information. A missing soldier was a problem that was going to take resources to solve. But solving it was going to have to wait for now. The immediate crisis was over. The enemy was retreating. The helicopters were providing cover. The next priority was to secure the area, establish a perimeter, and get his men out of the valley. All units, establish a defensive perimeter. I want security on all approaches. Medical personnel, start doing casualty assessment. Harris, get me a count of how many were moving and what condition they're in. The team moved to comply. They had been trained to shift from combat operations to casualty management, and they did it with the efficiency that came from practice and discipline. 2 soldiers were dead. 3 others were wounded, but not seriously. 12 soldiers fit and ready to move. And 1 soldier missing somewhere in the chaos. The Apaches continued to circle, providing security, scanning the terrain for any remaining enemy fighters. The command center back at the FOB was coordinating the next steps. There would be a recovery mission. There would be a search for Patterson. But, for now, the focus was on getting the surviving team members secured and ready for extraction. It was only later, after the helicopter had come and picked up the wounded, after the team had been flown back to the forward operating base, after the initial debriefs had been done and the preliminary reports had been filed, that Webb found out about the sniper. Harris had gotten the information from the command center, had tracked back through the radio logs, and had identified who had provided the critical fire support that turned the tide of the ambush. Sergeant Rick Donovan was his name. A sniper who had not been part of Webb's operation, who had not known who Webb was or what his mission was, but who had been in the right place at the right time and had made the decision to engage the enemy. Donovan had been the difference between an ambush that succeeded and an ambush that failed. Donovan's shots had saved lives, had allowed the team to regroup, had bought the time necessary for air support to arrive. Webb made a note to find Donovan when he got a chance. He wanted to thank him in person. He wanted to look that man in the eye and let him know that his actions had mattered, had made a difference, had kept people alive who might otherwise have died. But, first, Webb had to deal with Patterson. He had to deal with the investigation into how the intelligence had been compromised. He had to deal with the mission after action report, with the statements from his men, with the weight of knowing that 2 of his soldiers would not be going home. In a small room in the medical facility at the FOB, Donovan was already being debriefed. His commanding officer wanted to know exactly what he had seen, what he had decided, why he had engaged targets that were not on his original assignment. Donovan answered the questions with his usual minimalist approach. He had seen Americans in contact. He had assessed that they were being overwhelmed. He had made the determination that engaging the approaching reinforcements would improve the survival odds of the Americans on the ridge. So he had engaged them. "Your actions saved lives," his commanding officer told him. "How many shots did you fire?" 17, Donovan said. Chen's spotting was accurate. Probably got maybe 22 enemy fighters out of action, maybe more. Difficult to do exact count when the helicopters showed up. Well, it was excellent work. Exactly what we needed. I'm going to make sure this is documented in your file. Donovan nodded.
He did not particularly care about accolades or documentation. He had done the job. The Americans on the ridge had lived. That was what mattered. The rest was just procedure, just the military's way of keeping track of who had done what and why. What Donovan did not know, what Webb also did not know at this point, was that the search for Sergeant Dale Patterson was about to become much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Patterson was alive, but he was also no longer on the American side of the border. And the men who had taken him had plans for him that would make his survival far from assured. The ambush was over. The battle had been won. But the story was far from finished. The search for Sergeant Dale Patterson began within hours of the ambush. The intelligence apparatus of the military, which had failed them during the initial operation, was now mobilized with a different purpose. Find Patterson. Bring him home. These were the priorities. The entire network of human intelligence sources, aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, everything was focused on one goal: locating a missing American. What made the search particularly urgent was that nobody knew Patterson's condition. If he was wounded, he was dying. If he was captured, he might be interrogated. If he was being used as propaganda, he might already be dead, and his body might be valuable only as a symbol. The calculus of hostage situations in war zones was grim, and everyone involved in the search understood that time was the most critical factor. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to a worst-case scenario. At the headquarters of the regional intelligence operation, analysts were combing through reports, tracking movement patterns, analyzing radio chatter from known Taliban and terrorist frequencies. In a war zone, nothing happened without someone knowing about it, but the challenge was always separating signal from noise, finding the important information in the vast ocean of chatter that moved across the airwaves every single day. 3 days after the ambush, a piece of information came in that changed everything. A local source, someone whose information had been reliable in the past, reported that foreign fighters had been moved across the border into Pakistan. They were being held in a compound in the tribal areas, close to the Pakistani border. The source said there was an American with them. Could be a fighter captured from the area. Could be someone else. But there was an American. Webb received the intelligence briefing and made the decision immediately. Patterson was out there. Patterson was alive. That meant there was still a chance to bring him home. It meant that 2 missing soldiers did not have to become 2 dead soldiers, even if one of them was technically still missing. The challenge was that Pakistan was not Afghanistan. The United States could conduct military operations in Afghanistan with relative freedom because the Afghan government, such as it was, had authorized American presence. Pakistan was different. Pakistan was an ally, technically, but also a complicated ally. Pakistan's tribal areas were not fully under Pakistani government control. They were places where American operations were sometimes tolerated and sometimes not. Launching a military operation in Pakistan without Pakistani cooperation could create diplomatic incidents. It could create problems for American-Pakistani relations. It could create all sorts of complications. But this was Sergeant Dale Patterson. This was an American soldier. The decision had already been made before the briefing was even finished. Patterson was coming home. The diplomacy could be worked out after the fact. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Patterson back. Webb was chosen to lead the recovery operation. His team was rested now, resupplied, ready for another mission. The intelligence was not perfect. It was never perfect. But it was the best they had. The compound had been located to within a few kilometers. The analysts believed Patterson was there. The operation was set for early morning, when darkness could provide concealment and the enemy would be least expecting it. The night before the operation, Webb sat in a small room and looked at photographs of Patterson. Patterson had joined the military at age 21, right out of high school. He was now 35. He had a wife and 2 children. There was a photograph in the file of Patterson with his kids, probably taken on his last leave. Patterson was a big man, like Gomez, with a steady presence that made him reliable.
Webb had served with Patterson for 6 years. They had been through multiple deployments together.
Patterson was not just another soldier. He was a friend.
The next morning, before dawn, Webb and his team were loaded into helicopters again. They would approach the compound from an unexpected direction, would hit it hard and fast before the enemy could organize a response. The intelligence suggested there would be maybe a dozen fighters at the compound, a mix of Taliban and foreign fighters who had crossed over from Afghanistan. The Americans would have surprise, speed, and overwhelming firepower.
It should be enough. But assumptions about what should be enough had gotten them into trouble before.
This time, Webb was prepared for things to go wrong. This time, his team was prepared for a fight that might be even worse than the last one. The helicopter approach was smooth, and the insertion was quick. The team moved toward the compound, which looked like dozens of other compounds in that region, a simple structure, mud walls, a few outbuildings, nothing that stood out as important.
But, inside, supposedly, was Patterson. Inside was the mission objective.
The compound was dark, quiet. The attack started with flashbangs, grenades that created massive light and noise designed to disorient people.
The doors were blown open. The team poured in, moving fast, ready for resistance.
What they found was more resistance than expected.
The intelligence about a dozen fighters was wrong.
There were more.
Maybe double that number.
They had been warned, or they had expected something, or they had simply reinforced the position. The firefight was brief but intense. The SEAL team was better trained, better equipped, moving as a coordinated unit. The enemy fighters were confused, caught off guard, moving without organization. When the shooting stopped, 5 enemy fighters were dead and the compound was secure.
But Patterson was not there. Webb's first instinct was to feel the crushing disappointment of a false lead.
But he pushed that aside and focused on the tactical situation. They had the compound. They should search it.
There might be information.
There might be something that indicated where Patterson was being held. The search revealed a back room, accessed by a door hidden behind a collapsed section of wall. In that room, bound to a chair, barely conscious, was Patterson.
Patterson's condition was bad. He had been beaten.
He had been interrogated. He had been left without water in that back room for days.
But he was alive.
He was conscious, barely, but conscious. And when he saw Webb's face, Patterson's eyes showed recognition.
He knew he was not a prisoner of the enemy anymore. He knew he was going home.
"Easy, Dale," Webb said, cutting the bonds that held Patterson to the chair.
"We're getting you out of here."
Patterson tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Webb signaled for the medic, and they carefully got Patterson to his feet.
Patterson was semi-conscious, unable to walk on his own, but he was alive, and that was what mattered. The extraction was quick.
They had prepared for this, had a helicopter standing by, ready to come in the moment they had Patterson. The team moved out of the compound, carrying Patterson, providing security, making sure they were not ambushed on the way to the landing zone.
The enemy had learned their lesson from the previous operation.
This time, they did not try to organize a counter-assault. This time, they let the Americans leave with their captured soldier. The helicopter ride back to the forward operating base was quiet. Patterson was being tended to by the medic, being given water, being evaluated for serious injuries. Webb sat beside him, watching him, making sure he stayed conscious, making sure he stayed alive long enough to get to proper medical care. Patterson's eyes opened, focused on Webb for a moment. "Boss," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse.
"Right here," Webb replied. "You're going home, Dale. You're going to see your wife and your kids. Everything is going to be okay."
Patterson's eyes closed again, but there was a slight smile on his face. He had survived. Against all odds, he had been through interrogation and torture and deprivation, and he had survived. The psychology of survival was different for each person.
Some broke easily. Some held out until the very end.
Patterson had held out long enough for his team to come looking for him, long enough for them to find him, long enough to be rescued.
The aftermath of the recovery operation was complicated. Patterson required significant medical care.
He had infections from his wounds. He was malnourished. He had been through psychological trauma that would take months and years to process.
But he was alive. He would recover. He would go back to his family.
He would live the rest of his life knowing that his brothers had come looking for him, had not left him behind, had come across a border into a hostile country to bring him home. While Patterson was recovering, the military's investigation into the original ambush continued.
How had the intelligence been compromised? How had the enemy known that the SEALs were coming? The investigation pointed to a breakdown in the intelligence collection process. Someone had provided false or misleading information about the location of Hassan Khan.
Whether it was intentional or accidental, whether it was compromise or mistake, it was impossible to determine with certainty. What was certain was that the SEALs had been set up, had been expected, had been ambushed. But they had survived. 2 soldiers had been killed in the ambush, and their names would be added to the Wall of Honor, the memorial that every military unit maintained for those who had died in service. But the team itself had lived. The survivors would go on to other missions, other deployments, other operations. The war would continue. One person who received significant attention in the aftermath was Sergeant Rick Donovan. The sniper's actions during the ambush had been reviewed at multiple levels of command. His superiors were recommending him for a Medal of Valor. The exact details of what he had done, the number of shots, the precision of his work, all of it was being compiled into an official record. Donovan was not comfortable with the attention, but he understood that the military needed to recognize and reward performance in dangerous situations. What Donovan did not know, what happened quietly in the background without any official ceremony, was that his actions had been specifically requested to be recognized by the soldier who had benefited most directly from them. Webb submitted a formal commendation for Donovan, citing his actions, his initiative, his willingness to engage enemy forces in support of another unit that he had no direct connection to. The commendation was approved, and Donovan received a medal, a Bronze Star with V device, indicating that his actions had been in direct support of combat operations.
Webb never did meet Donovan face to face to thank him.
That was not how the military worked.
Units operated separately.
Soldiers rarely knew the people who saved their lives unless they were in their immediate chain of command. But Webb made sure that his commendation was specific, was detailed, made sure that everyone who read it would understand exactly what Donovan had done and how important it had been. For Donovan, the recognition was appreciated but secondary. What mattered to him was that the Americans had survived. What mattered was that he had made the decision to engage, had had the skill to execute, and had had the luck to be in the right place at the right time.
War was about luck as much as it was about skill. Donovan understood this.
He had seen too many skilled soldiers die in combat and too many average soldiers survive through sheer luck. As the months passed, the war continued. Donovan completed his rotation and went back to the United States.
Patterson completed his medical recovery and went back to his family.
Webb was promoted to commander and given a position at headquarters where he could influence policy. The soldiers who had died were remembered, mourned, their families provided for. The soldiers who had lived went on to other things, carrying the experience of the ambush with them, knowing that they had survived something that could have killed them. The broader impact of the operation was harder to measure. Hassan Khan, the original target, was never found. He disappeared into the network of safe houses and border crossings that honeycombed the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The intelligence that had been provided was a dead end, a false lead, a mistake in a larger pattern of mistakes that made the war difficult to win. But the operation itself, despite its cost, had been a demonstration of American military capability. It had shown that even when ambushed, even when separated, even when facing overwhelming odds, American soldiers could fight back, could survive, could accomplish their mission. 5 years after the ambush, Donovan was interviewed by a military historian who was compiling a book about special operations in Afghanistan. The historian asked him about that particular operation, about the moment when he had seen Americans being ambushed and had made the decision to engage.
Donovan thought about the question carefully before answering.
I was trained to make decisions in seconds, to see situations and assess them, to respond to what I saw, Donovan said. When I saw Americans being overrun, the decision to engage was already made before I had consciously thought about it.
My training told me what to do. I did it.
That's all there is to it. The historian pressed for more detail, wanted Donovan to talk about the emotional content of the decision, about whether he had felt fear or exhilaration or any of the things that people felt in extreme situations. Donovan declined to discuss emotions.
Emotions in combat were irrelevant.
What mattered was the decision and the execution. Everything else was narrative, was story, was the way people tried to make sense of situations that did not really make sense. But that was not entirely true. There was more to it than just decision and execution. The decision to be on that ridge, the decision to position himself in a way that allowed him to see the valley, the decision to have his rifle ready with ammunition loaded and scope dialed in, all of those decisions had been made by someone who was thinking, who was planning, who was preparing for possibilities.
Donovan had been ready.
When the moment came, he had not hesitated. But readiness was something that was built over years, built through training and experience and the discipline to maintain focus even when focus was difficult. By the time the historian published his book, Donovan had already left the military.
He had completed 21 years of service, well more than the minimum required to receive retirement benefits.
He had moved back to the United States, to a small town in Montana where he had grown up. He bought a ranch, started a business doing long-range hunting guides. He worked with hunters who came from around the world to hunt elk and deer in the mountains. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper in war made him an excellent hunting guide in peace. Webb, who had left the military at the same time, had taken a position with a defense contractor. He was older now, his hair gray, the weight of 2 decades of war visible in his face. But he still thought about Patterson, still thought about the men who had died in that ambush, still thought about the moment when everything could have gone differently.
Patterson had done even better.
With the support of the military community, with recognition as a wounded warrior, he had gone back to school, had gotten a degree in business administration, had started his own company. He was married still, with his 2 kids growing up, older now but still asking questions about what had happened to their father, still proud that he had served, still grateful that he had come home. On the 20th anniversary of the ambush, a small group of the survivors got together in Washington, D.C.
They met at the Vietnam Memorial, at the Wall of Names, and they remembered.
Webb was there, and Martinez, and Gomez, and Harris. And Patterson, walking normally now, the physical injuries healed, the psychological ones still something he worked through in therapy but manageable because he had come home, because his team had come looking for him, because on that terrible day when everything had gone wrong, one man on a distant ridge had made a decision that had changed everything. They did not talk much about the ambush, about the details of what had happened. They had talked about those details many times before in the years after it happened. Instead, they talked about their families, about the businesses they had started, about the lives they had been able to live because they had survived. They talked about the 2 men who had not survived, and they remembered them, and they were grateful for the time they had had with them, sorry that the war had taken them, but clear on the fact that their own lives, the lives they were living now, were made possible because others had died, because sacrifice had been made.
Nobody brought up Donovan. Nobody suggested contacting him or including him in the reunion.
The military was not like that.
Soldiers did not always know all the pieces of the puzzle. Soldiers did not always know everyone who had contributed to their survival. But Webb, in his own way, had made sure that Donovan's contribution was recognized.
The commendation was in the official record.
Anyone who looked would find it.
Anyone who wanted to understand what had happened would find Donovan's name there, would find the citation, would understand the role that a single sniper on a distant ridge had played in the survival of an entire team. Years later, a journalist would investigate the story, would track down the people involved, would try to piece together the narrative of what had happened on that day. The journalist would interview Donovan, would interview Webb, would interview Patterson, and would write a detailed account of the ambush and the recovery operation. The article would be published in a military magazine, would be read by soldiers and by the public. It would describe Donovan's actions, would praise his skill and his decision-making, would detail the moment when his shots began to change the outcome of a battle that had seemed unwinnable. But none of that was what really mattered. What really mattered was that soldiers had done their jobs. What really mattered was that they had trained, had prepared, had made decisions under pressure, had acted with courage and discipline. What really mattered was that lives had been saved because people had been willing to put their own lives at risk. This was the real story of war, not the dramatic narratives about heroism and valor, but the simple truth that people were put in impossible situations, and they did their best, and some lived and some died, and the ones who lived carried the weight of knowing why they were still alive. The ambush, the recovery, the aftermath, all of it was part of a war that would continue for years after these events. Soldiers would continue to be sent into harm's way. Intelligence would continue to be imperfect. Ambushes would continue to happen. But each time they happened, there were people who were trained and ready, who made decisions in seconds that would affect outcomes for years, who understood that the cost of their actions extended far beyond themselves. This was the story that connected Sergeant Rick Donovan on a distant ridge with Sergeant Dale Patterson in a captured compound with Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb leading his team in a valley thousands of miles from home. This was the story of what happened when split-second decisions meant everything, when one man's skill could determine the fate of many, when the threads of military service wove together in ways that were never planned but always meaningful. The war would eventually end, the soldiers would eventually come home, the conflicts would eventually be resolved or abandoned or transformed into something else. But the memory of these moments, the knowledge of what had been done, the understanding of why it had mattered, these things would endure. These things would be part of the historical record, would be part of the story of a nation at war, would be part of the personal narratives of men who had been tested and had not broken. And, on quiet evenings, when the noise of the world had died down, when a man could sit alone with his thoughts, a sniper on a ranch in Montana would remember the moment when he had seen Americans being ambushed and had made the decision to act. He would remember the feel of the rifle against his shoulder, the sight through the scope, the sense of purpose that had guided his actions. He would not think of himself as a hero. He was simply a soldier who had done his job. But he would know, with absolute certainty, that his actions had mattered, that lives existed today because of the decisions he had made, that the world was different because he had chosen to act. That was enough. That was everything.